The Crescent Hall had never seen such a gathering. Thousands of candles flickered in iron chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across marble floors worn smooth by centuries of ceremony. Every noble family in Valdoria had sent their daughters, each one dressed in silks and velvets, pearls and diamonds, all hoping to catch the eye of the most powerful man in the realm. The Luna trials. Once every generation, when an alpha king came of age without a mate, the ancient ritual was invoked. 3 days of tests, 3 nights of observation, and at the end, one woman would be chosen to rule beside him, to bear his heirs, to share his throne and his immortal life. Elowyn stood at the edge of the great hall, trying to make herself invisible against a pillar draped in midnight blue velvet. Her dress, a simple gown of pale silver that had belonged to her mother, felt like armor and accusation all at once. She shouldn't be here. Rowena had made that abundantly clear. You're only attending because the law requires all eligible women of noble blood to present themselves. Her stepmother had hissed that morning, fingers digging into Elowyn's arm hard enough to bruise. Stay in the shadows, don't speak, don't draw attention, and above all, don't embarrass your sisters. Her sisters. Elowyn's gaze drifted across the hall to where Lavinia and Odette stood in a cluster of admirers. Their gowns a matched set of crimson and gold that must have cost more than the entire household staff earned in a year. They were laughing, tossing their dark curls, performing the role of desirable brides with practiced ease. They weren't her sisters. Not truly. Rowena had married Elowyn's father when Elowyn was 7 years old, a widow with 2 daughters of her own and ambitions that stretched far beyond a minor lord's estate. When Elowyn's father died 3 years later, Rowena's pretense of affection had died with him. Now Elowyn was 22, and she had spent the last 12 years as little more than a servant in her own home, the daughter of the house reduced to scrubbing floors and mending clothes, eating in the kitchen with the cook, sleeping in a room barely larger than a closet. But noble blood was noble blood, and the Luna trials demanded her presence. A herald's horn cut through the hall's chatter, and the crowd fell silent with almost frightening speed. Elowyn felt her pulse quicken as every head turned toward the raised dais at the far end of the hall. He was already there. Alpha King Tavian of the Thornhaven line sat upon a throne of black iron and ancient bone, his posture deceptively relaxed. Even from this distance, Elowyn could see why they called him the Winter King. His features were sharp as cut glass, all severe angles and shadows beneath cheekbones that could slice. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his eyes, she had heard they were the color of a frozen lake, pale blue edged with silver. He was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, in the way a storm was beautiful, something magnificent and terrible that you admired from a safe distance. He had ruled for 6 years since his father's death, and in that time, he had never smiled in public, never taken a lover, never shown interest in any woman presented to him. The court whispered that his heart had turned to ice, that he was incapable of feeling, that whoever became his Luna would be queen of a kingdom, but wife to a statue. Elowyn thought that sounded unbearably lonely. The herald began calling names, and one by one, the noble daughters approached the dais to curtsy before their king. Elowyn watched Lavinia glide forward with practiced grace, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a river of blood. Odette followed, equally poised, equally perfect. Neither received more than a glance from the throne. Elowyn allowed herself a small breath of relief. Perhaps she could slip away unnoticed. Perhaps she could. Lady Elowyn Ashford. Her name rang through the hall like a death knell. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand paralyzed against her pillar, while hundreds of eyes searched the crowd for her. Lady Elowyn Ashford, the herald repeated, impatience creeping into his voice. She had no choice. Elowyn stepped away from the pillar and began the long walk toward the dais, acutely aware of how her mother's old gown must look compared to the elaborate confections surrounding her. Plain, simple, poor. She was halfway across the hall when she felt hands grab her from behind. "Did you really think we'd let you embarrass us?" Lavinia's voice was a venomous whisper against her ear. Elowyn didn't have time to react before she felt the fabric of her gown tear. A violent ripping sound that seemed to echo off the marble walls. Cold air hit her back as the dress split from neck to waist. Elowyn gasped, clutching at the ruined fabric, but Odette was already there, yanking at the sleeves until they came away entirely. The silver gown, her mother's gown, fell apart in pieces, leaving Eowyn standing in the center of the crescent hall in nothing but her thin shift. Laughter erupted around her. Not the polite titters of scandalized nobles, but genuine, cruel amusement. Someone pointed. Someone else made a comment about beggars infiltrating the trials. Eowyn heard Rowena's distinctive laugh rise above the rest, sharp and satisfied. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only stand there with her arms wrapped around herself, tears burning in her eyes, wishing the marble floor would open up and swallow her whole. This was it. The final humiliation. The ultimate proof that she was nothing, that she would always be nothing, that she deserved nothing. Then the laughter stopped. It didn't fade or quiet. It simply ceased, as if someone had drawn a blade across the throat of every sound in the hall. The silence that followed was so complete that Eowyn could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She looked up. The Alpha King was standing. In 6 years of rule, Tavian had never risen from his throne during a public ceremony. He had never shown interest in anything or anyone beyond the bare minimum required by duty. Yet now he was descending the steps of the dais, his movements fluid and predatory, his pale eyes fixed on Eowyn with an intensity that made her forget her shame. The crowd parted before him, like water before the prow of a ship. No one dared speak. No one dared breathe. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his ice-blue eyes, close enough to catch the scent of pine and winter wind that clung to him. His expression was unreadable, carved from the same stone as his throne. Then, without a word, he reached up and unclasped the heavy cloak from his own shoulders. The fabric was black as midnight, lined with silver fur, and emblazoned with the snarling wolf of his house. It was the cloak of the Alpha King, the symbol of his authority, his protection, his claim. He draped it around her shoulders. The weight of it settled over Eowyn like a promise, warm from his body, soft against her bare skin. She stared up at him, unable to comprehend what was happening, unable to process the gasps rippling through the crowd. "What is your name?" His voice was low, rough, as if he hadn't used it in a very long time. "Eowyn," she whispered. "Eowyn Ashford." Something flickered in those pale eyes, something that might have been recognition, or surprise, or something far more dangerous. "Eowyn," he repeated, and her name in his mouth sounded like a spell being cast. "You will come with me." He turned and walked back toward the dais, clearly expecting her to follow. Eowyn stood, rooted in place, clutching the edges of his cloak, aware that every person in the hall was staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to fury to naked envy. Her gaze found Rowena in the crowd. Her stepmother's face had gone white as bone, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Lavinia looked like she might faint. Odette was already crying. Eowyn didn't understand what had just happened. She didn't understand why the Alpha King had singled her out, why he had given her his cloak, why he had spoken her name like it meant something. But as she gathered her courage and began to follow him, she felt the weight of his cloak around her shoulders and knew with sudden, terrifying certainty that her life had just changed forever. The corridors of Thornhaven Palace stretched endlessly before Eowyn, each one grander and more intimidating than the last. Tapestries depicting ancient hunts lined the walls, woven wolves frozen mid-leap as they brought down stags and bears and creatures she couldn't name. Torches burned in iron sconces, casting long shadows that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them. She followed the Alpha King in silence, his cloak still wrapped around her like a shield, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floors. He hadn't spoken since commanding her to follow, and she hadn't dared to break the silence. What could she possibly say? "Thank you for saving me from humiliation? Why did you do it? What do you want from me?" The questions burned in her throat, but fear kept them trapped there. Finally, he stopped before a heavy oak door carved with the phases of the moon. He pushed it open to reveal a chamber that took Eowyn's breath away. A fire crackled in an enormous hearth. A bed large enough for 6 people dominated one wall, draped in furs and silks. Windows overlooked a moonlit garden where silver flowers bloomed despite the autumn chill. "These will be your rooms," Tavian said, still not looking at her. "Servants will bring you proper clothing, food, whatever you require." Eowyn stepped inside, overwhelmed by the sheer luxury of it. She had grown up in a noble house, yes, but Rowena had stripped away every comfort years ago. She couldn't remember the last time she had slept in a real bed, let alone one like this. "I don't understand," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Tavian paused in the doorway. What don't you understand? Any of this? Elowyn turned to face him, clutching his cloak tighter. Why did you help me? Why did you give me your cloak? The whole kingdom will be talking about what it means, and I don't even know what it means. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. His gaze traveled over her face with an intensity that made her skin warm, as if he was searching for something, cataloging every detail, committing her to memory. Do you know what happens when an alpha king gives his cloak to a woman? He asked quietly. Elowyn shook her head. It is a declaration of protection. A statement that she belongs to him, that any who harm her will answer to him personally. His jaw tightened. It is, in essence, a claim. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. But you don't know me, Elowyn protested. We've never even spoken before tonight. Why would you claim a woman you've never met? Tavian's expression wavered, something passing through his eyes too quickly for her to catch. I don't know, he admitted, and the confession seemed to cost him. When I saw you standing there, when I saw what they had done to you, I felt. He stopped abruptly, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Felt what? Elowyn pressed. It doesn't matter. His voice had gone cold again, the brief moment of openness, shuttered behind walls of ice. You will stay here until the trials conclude. You will be safe. That is all you need to know. He turned to leave, and Elowyn acted on instinct, reaching out to catch his arm. The moment her fingers touched his sleeve, the world tilted. Heat exploded through her palm and raced up her arm, spreading through her chest like wildfire. She heard herself gasp, felt her knees weaken, saw Tavian's eyes widen with shock, as he clearly felt it too. For one endless heartbeat, they stood connected by her grip on his arm, staring at each other as something ancient and powerful crackled in the air between them. Then Tavian wrenched himself away, his breath coming harsh and fast. Don't, he said roughly. Don't touch me. Elowyn stared at her hand, still tingling with phantom heat. What was that? What just happened? But he was already retreating, his movements no longer fluid but jerky, almost desperate. Stay in these rooms. Don't wander the palace alone. Don't let anyone in except the servants I send. Tavian, that is not my name to you. His voice cracked like a whip. You will address me as your majesty, or you will not address me at all. The door slammed behind him, leaving Elowyn alone in the beautiful room with a racing heart and more questions than she'd ever had in her life. She sank onto the edge of the bed, pressing her palm to her chest where the strange heat still lingered. What had happened when she touched him? Why had he reacted with such fear? And why, despite his coldness, despite his dismissal, did some part of her already ache to follow him? Elowyn tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ghost of that strange heat racing through her veins. She saw Tavian's face, the flash of something raw and vulnerable before his walls slammed back into place. She heard his voice, rough and desperate, telling her not to touch him. What was he afraid of? Hours passed. The fire burned low. Servants had come and gone, bringing a silk nightgown, platters of food she couldn't eat, pitchers of water she couldn't drink. Everything felt muted, distant, as if the world had shifted slightly out of alignment, and she was the only one who noticed. Near midnight, Elowyn gave up on sleep entirely. She wrapped herself in a velvet robe left by the servants and drifted to the window, drawn by the silver light spilling across the garden below. The moon was nearly full, hanging heavy and luminous in the cloudless sky. The silver flowers she had noticed earlier seemed to glow beneath its light, their petals open wide as if drinking in the radiance. Without quite deciding to, Elowyn found herself leaving her room. The corridors were empty at this hour, lit only by the occasional guttering torch. She moved silently, following some instinct she couldn't name, drawn toward the garden by a pull she didn't understand. The night air hit her skin like cold water, shocking and clarifying. She stepped onto a stone path that wound between beds of those strange silver blooms, their fragrance sweet and wild, unlike any flower she knew. Then she heard it, a low sound, somewhere between a groan and a growl, coming from deeper in the garden. Every rational thought told her to run, to flee back to the safety of her room. But her feet carried her forward instead, around a hedge of moonlit roses, into a small clearing dominated by an ancient fountain. Tavian was there. He knelt on the ground beside the fountain, his hands braced against the stone rim, his head bowed. Even in the darkness, she could see that something was terribly wrong. His body was trembling, muscles spasming beneath his thin shirt. Dark veins crawled up his neck, visible even from a distance, pulsing with something that looked like liquid shadow. "Your Majesty?" Elowen's voice came out barely above a whisper. His head snapped up, and she stumbled backward with a cry. His eyes were gold. Not blue, not silver, but molten, burning gold, like twin flames set into his skull. The pupils had elongated into vertical slits, and when his lips pulled back from his teeth, she saw fangs where none should be. "Run." The word was barely human, torn from a throat that seemed to be reshaping itself. Elowen, run. She should have. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to escape, to get as far away from this creature as possible. Instead, she stepped closer. "You're hurt," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let me help you." "You can't help me." He was fighting to speak, each word a battle. "No one can. This curse, it's killing me, has been killing me for months, and now," he broke off with a snarl, as another spasm racked his body. The dark veins spread further, creeping across his jaw, down his arms. In the moonlight, she could see the skin around them turning gray, dying. "Now what?" Elowen demanded, kneeling beside him despite every warning screaming in her head. "What's happening to you?" Tavian's golden eyes fixed on her face, and for a moment, she saw past the wolf, past the king, to the man beneath. A man in agony. A man losing a battle he had been fighting alone for far too long. "You," he whispered. "When I saw you tonight, something woke up. Something I've been suppressing for years. The wolf, my wolf, it recognized you." "Recognized me as what?" But he didn't answer. His control shattered. One moment he was kneeling before her, trembling and human. The next, he had lunged, moving faster than anything human should, bearing her backward onto the cold ground. His body covered hers, his weight pinning her to the earth, and she felt his breath hot against her throat. "Tavian." She said his name without thinking, without the title, without the distance he had demanded. "Tavian, please." A sound escaped him, something between a sob and a howl. His nose traced the line of her neck, breathing her in, and she felt his whole body shudder with the effort of restraint. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her skin. "I'm so sorry. I can't stop it. I can't." His teeth sank into the curve where her neck met her shoulder. Pain exploded through Elowen, white-hot and blinding, but the agony was already transforming into something else. Heat flooded her veins, molten and overwhelming, burning away everything she thought she knew about herself. She could feel him through the bite, actually feel him, his emotions pouring into her like water into an empty vessel. Desperation, longing, a love so fierce it bordered on madness, and beneath it all, a terrible guilt that was already consuming him. Her hands found his shoulders, meaning to push him away, but her fingers curled into his shirt instead, pulling him closer. The pain had become pleasure, had become something beyond either, something cosmic and consuming that made her forget her own name. Then it was over. Tavian tore himself away from her with a broken cry, scrambling backward until his back hit the fountain's stone base. Blood stained his lips, her blood, and his eyes had returned to their normal pale blue, wide with horror at what he had done. Elowen. Her name was a prayer and a curse in his mouth. "Elowen, what have I done?" She tried to respond, tried to tell him that she was all right, that she wasn't afraid, but her body had other plans. The heat that had filled her veins was still spreading, still changing her, and she could feel consciousness slipping away like sand through her fingers. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Tavian crawling toward her, tears streaming down his face, his hands reaching for her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. Then there was nothing but fire and shadow, and the distant howling of wolves. Elowen woke to the sound of screaming. It took her a moment to realize the screams were her own, trapped in her throat, emerging as nothing more than ragged gasps. She was lying on something soft, surrounded by warmth, and when she forced her eyes open, she found herself back in the moonlit chamber she had been given. How had she gotten here? Memory returned in fragments. The garden, Tavian's golden eyes, the bite. Her hand flew to her neck, expecting to find torn flesh and dried blood. Instead, Her fingers traced skin that was nearly smooth, bearing only the faintest raised marks where his teeth had pierced her. The wound should have been savage, should have required stitches and weeks of healing. Yet here she was, whole and alive, with nothing but a strange tingling warmth where the bite had been. "You're awake." Elowen turned her head to find an elderly woman sitting beside her bed, her weathered face lined with concern and something that might have been wonder. She wore the simple gray dress of a palace healer, and her hands were busy grinding herbs in a small stone mortar. "Where is he?" Elowen's voice came out hoarse, barely recognizable. "Where is Tavian?" The healer's expression tightened. "The king is in his chambers. He collapsed shortly after bringing you here. The curse." She stopped herself, pressing her lips together as if she had said too much. "What curse?" Elowen pushed herself upright, ignoring the wave of dizziness that followed. "I saw something in the garden, dark veins spreading across his skin. He said it was killing him." The healer studied her for a long moment, something shifting in her eyes. "How much did he tell you?" "Nothing. He told me nothing except that his wolf recognized me." Elowen swung her legs over the side of the bed, gratified when they held her weight. "Take me to him. My lady, you should rest. Take me to him now." Perhaps it was something in her voice, or perhaps the healer saw something in Elowen's face that convinced her argument was futile. Either way, she set down her mortar and rose with a resigned sigh. "Follow me." The king's chambers were in the oldest part of the palace, behind doors carved with wolves and moons that seemed to watch Elowen as she approached. 2 guards stood at attention, but they parted at the healer's nod, allowing both women to pass. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a dying fire and a single candle beside the massive bed. And in that bed, barely visible beneath a mountain of furs, lay Tavian. Elowen's breath caught in her throat. He looked like death. His skin had gone gray, stretched tight over bones that seemed sharper than they had been hours ago. The dark veins she had seen in the garden now covered half his body, pulsing with that terrible shadow, spreading even as she watched. His breathing was shallow, labored, each exhale rattling in his chest. "The curse accelerated after he bit you," the healer said quietly, as if the effort of restraining his wolf used up whatever strength he had left. "How long does he have?" The healer's silence was answer enough. Elowen moved to the bedside, sinking onto the edge of the mattress. Up close, she could see the fine tremors running through his body, could hear the soft sounds of pain escaping his unconscious lips. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. Heat sparked between them, that same electric connection she had felt before, but now, it was different. Now she could feel something flowing through that connection. Something dark and poisonous trying to crawl from his body into hers. And beneath it, fighting against the corruption, she felt something else entirely. Power. It rose from somewhere deep inside her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the furs or the strange heat of his skin. It gathered in her chest, spread down her arms, pooled in her palms where they pressed against his hand. "No," she whispered to herself. "Not this. Anything but this." But the power didn't care about her fear. It didn't care about the years she had spent hiding, suppressing, pretending it didn't exist. It recognized the curse that was killing him, and it wanted to destroy it. "My lady?" The healer's voice seemed very far away. "My lady, your hands?" Elowen looked down and felt the last of her resistance crumble. Golden light was pouring from her palms, soft and radiant, wrapping around Tavian's hand like liquid sunrise. She could feel it working, feel it seeking out the dark veins of corruption and burning them away. The curse fought back, vicious and hungry, but her power was older, purer, fueled by something she couldn't name. She poured everything she had into him. The shadow retreated, the dark veins faded, shrinking back toward whatever wound had first allowed them entry. Color returned to his skin, and his breathing steadied, deepened, and became the easy rhythm of natural sleep. When it was over, Elowen slumped forward, utterly drained. She was vaguely aware of the healer catching her, of voices raised in alarm, of footsteps rushing into the room, but all she could focus on was Tavian's face. Peaceful now, the lines of pain smoothed away. She had saved him. "What manner of creature are you?" the healer breathed, staring at Elowen with something between fear and reverence. Elowen didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the power she had spent her entire life hiding had just been witnessed by someone who served the palace. Her secret was no longer her own. As consciousness began to fade, she thought she felt Tavian's fingers tighten around hers. Thought she heard him whisper something in an ancient language, words that sounded like a prayer. Then, darkness took her, and she knew nothing more. When she woke again, he was gone. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the night in the king's chambers. 3 weeks since Elowen had saved Tavian's life with power she shouldn't possess. 3 weeks since she had been escorted back to her stepmother's house with nothing but a formal letter announcing that the Luna trials had been postponed indefinitely. 3 weeks of silence. Elowen stood at the window of her tiny room, staring out at the gray autumn sky. The cloak was gone, confiscated by Rowena, the moment Elowen had crossed the threshold. Her mother's ruined dress had been burned. Every trace of her time at the palace had been erased, as if it had never happened at all. But the bite mark on her neck remained, hidden beneath high collars and carefully arranged hair. And at night, when she closed her eyes, she could still feel him, could still sense him somewhere out there, a distant warmth at the edge of her consciousness that flared whenever she dreamed. The dreams were getting worse. In them, Tavian came to her chamber. He knelt beside her bed and spoke to her in that ancient language she couldn't understand but somehow felt in her bones. He touched her face with trembling fingers, called her words that sounded like moonlight and forever. She always woke, reaching for him. He was never there. Elowen! Rowena's voice cut through her reverie like a blade. Elowen turned from the window, composing her features into the blank mask she had perfected over 12 years of servitude. Her stepmother stood in the doorway, flanked by Lavinia and Odette. All three wore expressions of barely contained triumph. "You have visitors," Rowena said, her lips curving into a smile that made Elowen's blood run cold. Important visitors. She didn't have time to ask what that meant before hands grabbed her arms and dragged her from the room. The great hall of her childhood home had been transformed. Where dusty portraits and faded tapestries usually hung, now there were banners bearing an unfamiliar crest, a silver sword piercing a wolf's heart. And standing beneath those banners were men in armor, their faces hard and cold and hungry. "The Witch Hunters Guild," Lavinia whispered gleefully in Elowen's ear. "Rowena sent them a letter weeks ago. They're very interested in what you did at the palace." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Elowen's feet. One of the armored men stepped forward, his graying beard doing nothing to soften the cruelty in his eyes. "Lady Elowen Ashford?" "Yes," she managed. "I am Commander Valdric of the Witch Hunters Guild. You stand accused of practicing forbidden magic within the walls of Thornhaven Palace." He produced a scroll from his belt, unrolling it with ceremonial precision. "A witness has testified that you used unnatural power to interfere with the natural order, specifically by healing a curse that was divine punishment for the sins of the wolf-blooded." "Divine punishment?" Elowen stared at him in disbelief. "He was dying, as the blessed texts command." Valdric's voice was ice. "The wolf-blooded are abominations. Those who aid them share their corruption. This is insane. I was helping him. He's your king." "He is no king of ours." Valdric nodded to his men. "Seize her." Elowen tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Armored hands grabbed her, forcing her to her knees. She caught a glimpse of Rowena watching from the doorway, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes, and understood with horrible clarity what had happened. Her stepmother had witnessed Elowen being taken to Tavian's chambers that night, had bribed or threatened a servant to learn what had occurred, had waited until the scandal died down, and then sold Elowen to the witch hunters in exchange for political favor or gold. "You'll burn for this," Elowen spat at her. Rowena merely smiled. "No, dear. That will be you." They dragged her from the house, threw her into an iron-barred wagon, and carried her away from everything she had ever known. The journey lasted hours, or perhaps days. Elowen lost track of time in the darkness of her prison. When they finally stopped, she was hauled out to face a massive stone fortress perched on the edge of a cliff. The witch hunter's stronghold. The place where women like her were brought to confess and die. "Any last words before your trial?" Valdric asked, as they marched her toward the gates. Elowen raised her chin, refusing to let them see her terror. "The king will come for me," Valdric laughed. "The king is dead, girl. Or as good as. My sources say the curse returned the moment your magic faded. He won't live out the week." The words hit her like a physical blow. Tavian was dying. Whatever she had done, it hadn't been enough. The curse had only been pushed back, not destroyed, and without her there to fight it. No, she whispered, but the gates were already closing behind her, and the darkness of the fortress swallowed her whole. Her trial was a farce. They brought her before a council of witch hunters, read a list of accusations that grew more absurd with each item, and demanded she confess to consorting with wolf demons. When she refused, they threw her in a cell carved from the living rock of the cliff and left her to contemplate her execution. It was scheduled for dawn. Eowyn sat in the darkness, her back against the cold stone wall, and tried to feel for that distant warmth she had sensed since the night of the bite. That connection to Tavian that hummed beneath her skin, even now. But there was nothing, only cold and silence, and the growing certainty that she was going to die alone in this terrible place. Then the screaming started. At first, Eowyn thought she was imagining it. But the sounds grew louder, closer, accompanied by crashes and the distinctive clash of metal on metal. Through the small barred window of her cell, she could see torches moving frantically across the fortress courtyard. Then, she heard the howling. It came from everywhere and nowhere. A chorus of wolf voices raised in fury. The door of her cell shuddered as something massive slammed against it. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th impact, it burst inward. A wolf stood in the doorway. Not just any wolf, but a creature the size of a horse, with fur the color of midnight and eyes that burned like molten gold. It looked at her for a long moment, something terrifyingly intelligent in its gaze. Then it lowered its head in what could only be a bow. "Come," a voice said behind it. And Eowyn looked up to see a woman standing in the ruined doorway. She was tall and fierce, with silver hair and the bearing of a warrior. "The Alpha King sent us. You're going home." Eowyn woke to unfamiliar sounds. Wind howling through mountain passes. Wolves calling to each other in the distance. The crackle of a fire that smelled of pine and ancient magic. She opened her eyes to find herself in a chamber carved from the heart of a mountain. The walls were raw stone, but hung with tapestries depicting wolves running beneath full moons. Furs covered the bed where she lay, and a fire burned in a hearth, shaped like a snarling wolf's mouth. "You're safe now." The silver-haired woman from the fortress sat beside the bed, her weathered face softened by the firelight. "I am Seraphina, elder of the Thornhaven pack. You are in Shadowpeak, the king's hidden stronghold, Tavian." Eowyn tried to sit up, wincing at the ache in her bones. "They said he was dying. They said the curse. He lives, yes, for now." Seraphina's expression grew grave. "Thanks to you, he survived long enough to send us for you. But the curse has returned, stronger than before. He fights it still. But..." She stopped, shaking her head. "Take me to him." "I cannot. He has forbidden anyone from entering his chambers." The elder's eyes met Eowyn's with uncomfortable directness. "Especially you." The words struck deeper than they should have. "Why?" "Because of what he did to you. The bite." Seraphina leaned forward. "Do you understand what happened that night in the garden?" Eowyn's hand moved instinctively to her neck, to the faded marks that still tingled whenever she thought of him. "He lost control. The curse, his wolf." "His wolf recognized you," Seraphina interrupted. "Not as a stranger, not as a potential mate. It recognized you as the one, the other half of his soul, that he has been waiting for since the day he was born." Eowyn stared at her. "That's not possible. We'd never met before the trials." "It doesn't matter. The mate bond doesn't care about logic or time or circumstance. It simply is." Seraphina's voice softened. "When Tavian bit you, he initiated a claiming. A sacred ritual that binds 2 wolves together for eternity. But you're not a wolf, Eowyn. You're human. Or at least, you were." The room seemed to spin. "What do you mean?" "I was? The bite began to change you. Your body is trying to become something it was never meant to be." Seraphina reached out and took Eowyn's hand, her fingers pressing against the pulse point at her wrist. "Can you feel it? The wolf spirit inside you fighting to emerge?" And suddenly, Eowyn could. Now that she knew what to look for, she could sense it beneath her skin, a wild presence that paced and prowled and howled for release. It had been growing since the night of the bite, feeding on her confusion and fear and desperate longing for a man she barely knew. "But there's a problem," Seraphina continued. "Your magic. The same power that saved Tavian's life is now fighting the transformation. It sees the wolf spirit as an invader and keeps destroying it before it can take hold. Isn't that good? Elowen asked. If I'm not meant to be a wolf, it's killing you. The elder's voice was flat, final. Every time your magic destroys the wolf spirit, it uses more of your life force. Eventually, there will be nothing left. She paused. This is why Tavian refuses to see you. He believes he has condemned you to death with his bite. Elowen sat in silence, trying to process everything she had just learned. She was dying. Tavian was dying. And somehow, impossibly, they were bound together by a ritual neither of them had chosen. Is there a cure? She finally asked. Seraphina hesitated. There is a way. If you complete the bond, if you fully accept the transformation and claim him as he claimed you, your magic might integrate with the wolf spirit instead of fighting it. Might? No human has survived a claiming in over 300 years. The odds are not in your favor. Elowen closed her eyes, feeling the wolf spirit stirring restlessly inside her, feeling her magic rise up to crush it, and feeling the weakness that followed as another piece of her life force burned away. And if I don't try? Then you die slowly over the next few weeks, and Tavian dies, knowing he killed the woman fate chose for him. Seraphina's voice gentled. He's already preparing for that outcome. He's already making arrangements for what happens after. What kind of arrangements? But the elder wouldn't answer. She simply rose, patted Elowen's hand, and left her alone with the fire, and the furs, and the choice before her. That night, Elowen dreamed of him again. But this dream was different. This time, she could feel him in a way she never had before, could sense his presence as clearly as if he were lying beside her. When she opened her eyes in the dream, he was there, kneeling by her bed, his face drawn with grief. I'm sorry, he whispered in the old tongue, and somehow she understood every word. I'm sorry I did this to you. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to resist. I'm sorry I'm not strong enough to let you go. Elowen reached for him, but her hand passed through his form like mist. Please, she said. Please don't give up. His smile was the saddest thing she had ever seen. I've already made my choice. Tomorrow, I go to the Grove of Ancestors. The curse will take me, and when it does, I'll follow you into whatever comes next. He leaned close, his lips brushing her forehead like a ghost. Wait for me, my heart. I won't be long. She woke with a scream on her lips, and tears streaming down her face. The dream had been real. She knew it with absolute certainty. Tavian was going to let the curse kill him because he couldn't bear to live with what he had done. He was going to die, and she was the only one who could stop him. Elowen threw herself from the bed before the last echoes of her scream had faded. Her body protested violently, waves of weakness washing over her, as her magic and the wolf spirit continued their endless war. She ignored it, staggering toward the door on legs that trembled with each step. Where is he? She demanded of the guard outside her chamber. The wolf warrior stared at her in shock. My lady, you should be in bed. Where is he? Something in her voice made him answer. The Grove of Ancestors. It lies 3 miles west, past the ridge. His face crumpled with grief. But it's too late. The ritual began at midnight. By dawn, the king will. Elowen didn't wait to hear the rest. She was already running. The fortress was a maze of stone corridors and carved stairways, but instinct guided her to an exit, a small door that opened onto a mountain path still dark with pre-dawn shadows. The cold hit her like a fist, stealing her breath, but she didn't stop. 3 miles. She had to cover 3 miles in a body that was barely holding together. She made it perhaps 100 yards before her legs gave out. The ground was hard and frozen beneath her, and for a moment, Elowen simply lay there, gasping, feeling her strength ebbing away. This was it. This was as far as she could go. Tavian was going to die, and she couldn't even. No. The word blazed through her mind with sudden, ferocious clarity. She thought of her mother's ruined dress, torn away by cruel hands. She thought of 12 years spent serving people who hated her, hiding her true self, pretending to be less than she was. She thought of Tavian's face when he had given her his cloak, the first person in her entire life who had looked at her and seen something worth protecting. She was not going to let him die. Something cracked inside her, a barrier she had spent her entire life maintaining, and instead of trying to rebuild it, instead of fighting the wild presence that howled for release, Elowen did something she had never done before. She let go. The pain was indescribable. Her bones shattered and reformed. Her muscles tore and rebuilt. Her skin rippled and flowed like water, taking a new shape. She screamed, but the sound that emerged was not human. It was a howl, high and fierce and filled with primal triumph. When it was over, Elowen stood on 4 legs, her body covered in fur the color of fresh snow. She could see farther than she ever had, could smell scents she had no names for, could feel the mountain beneath her paws as if it were part of her own body. The wolf spirit was no longer fighting her magic. They had merged, becoming something new, something that was purely and completely her. And through the bond that now sang clear and strong in her blood, she could feel Tavian. Elowen ran. She flew across the mountain landscape, faster than any horse, faster than the wind itself. The grove of ancestors rose before her. Ancient trees twisted into shapes around a clearing, where torches burned against the coming dawn. She burst through the tree line just as the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern sky. The grove was filled with wolves in both forms, standing in silent witness around a raised stone altar. And on that altar, Tavian knelt in human form, his head bowed, his hands bound before him with chains of silver that smoked against his skin. Before him stood a wolf elder, with a blade of pure silver, raising it high as ritual words poured from his lips. "Stop!" The word tore from Elowen's throat as she shifted back to human form, naked and glorious and burning with power that lit up the entire grove. Every head turned toward her, every eye widened in disbelief, but she had eyes only for Tavian. He was staring at her, as if she were a ghost, as if she were a goddess, as if she were every dream he had ever dreamed made suddenly, impossibly real. "Elowen?" Her name was a broken whisper on his lips. "How? You don't get to leave me," she said, striding through the parting crowd, her bare feet leaving prints of golden light on the ground. "You don't get to make that choice for both of us. Not when I've spent my entire life waiting for you without even knowing it." She reached the altar and grabbed his bound hands, ignoring the burn of silver against her palms. "The bond," the elder protested, "it cannot be completed without her claiming him in return?" Elowen turned to face the gathered pack, and her voice rang with authority she had never known she possessed. "Then, watch." She turned back to Tavian, cupping his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You saved me when I was broken and humiliated. You showed me what it felt like to be worthy of protection." Her voice cracked. "Now let me save you." She kissed him, pouring every ounce of the love she had discovered in these weeks into the press of her lips against his, and when she finally pulled back, she bent her head to his throat, to the exact spot where neck met shoulder, and she bit down. His blood was fire and starlight on her tongue. Through the bond, she felt the curse recoil, felt it burn away like shadows before the sun. She felt his wolf spirit rise to meet hers, felt their souls intertwine in a bond that death itself could not sever. When she finally released him, the chains of silver had melted away, and Tavian's eyes were clear, bright, and free of any trace of corruption. "My queen," he breathed, and the title was a prayer. Around them, the pack erupted into howls of celebration, wolf voices raised in honor of their king and his bride. But Elowen barely heard them. She was lost in Tavian's arms, in his kiss, in the overwhelming rightness of finally being exactly where she belonged. Later, she would learn that Rowena and her daughters had been exiled in disgrace, their titles stripped, that the Witch Hunters Guild had been disbanded by royal decree, that her story had spread across the realm, inspiring others who had hidden their true selves. But in that moment, standing in the grove of ancestors, with dawn breaking gold across the mountains, none of that mattered. All that mattered was Tavian's arms around her, his heart beating against hers, and the simple, profound truth that settled into her bones like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. She was exactly where she was meant to be. She was home. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you'd like to listen on the go, all my stories are also available on Spotify under my name. You'll find the link in the description below. A big thank you to everyone who's following. Your support truly means the world to me.